It was Thursday, September 18th, and the ballroom at the Tacoma Convention Center smelled like catered salmon and polished wood. My father stood at the podium under a banner that read, "Celebrating 32 years of leadership, Dennis Preston." The microphone caught every breath he took. 70, maybe 80, employees from the City of Tacoma's Facilities Operations Department filled the round tables, along with vendors, contractors, and a few city council members. My older brother Ethan sat at the head table beside him, straight-backed, smiling, like he already owned the future. Dad thanked people by name. His executive assistant, the maintenance supervisors, a contractor who'd been with him since 2004. He even thanked the catering manager. Laughter rose and fell in warm waves. Retirement speeches are predictable that way. Gratitude, nostalgia, applause. Then someone from the back called out half-joking, "What about your daughter?" There was a pause, just long enough to register. My father chuckled into the microphone. "Oh, Maya." He shook his head lightly, like it was harmless. "She's nothing." The word landed harder than it sounded. A few people laughed. Not cruelly, just reflexively. The kind of laughter that follows the tone set by a man who's run a department for 3 decades. I was seated at the last table, near the exit, close enough to hear the hum of the ice machine through the wall. My mother Laura stared down at her folded hands. Ethan didn't turn around. "She's nothing." The microphone amplified it, made it official. Something inside me went very still. I stood up. The scrape of my chair against the hardwood cut through the room sharper than the laughter had. Conversations faltered. My heels sounded too loud as I walked toward the stage. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't shaking. I was carrying a plain manila folder tucked under my arm, the same one that had lived in my desk drawer for 3 years. Dad saw it when I reached the riser. For a fraction of a second, his smile tightened. I didn't take the microphone. I didn't need it. I placed the folder gently on the podium, beside his retirement plaque, the engraved bronze plate that listed his years of unwavering commitment to safety and integrity. The irony felt almost clinical. This is related to the facilities operations audit from 3 years ago, I said, my voice steady enough to surprise me. I believe Janice should see it. Janice Caldwell, Chief Operations Officer for the city, and my father's direct superior, was seated 2 tables from the front. Silver hair, navy suit posture, like she'd never once been late to anything in her life. She had been watching from the moment I stood. Dad reached for the folder. Janice stood before he could. "If it concerns departmental records," she said evenly, "I'll take that." The room shifted. Not loudly, but palpably. She opened the folder. The first page caught the light, an internal safety compliance report. The original version. Not the one that had been filed. Dad's smile disappeared. No one laughed this time. And for the first time in my life, my father no longer controlled the microphone. The morning after the retirement party was Friday, September 19th. I didn't go into the office. I called in and used a personal day. Tacoma woke up gray and damp, the kind of Pacific Northwest morning that makes everything feel quieter than it is. I sat at my small kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone cold, staring at my phone as if it might explain what had happened the night before. She's nothing. It wasn't the first time my father had erased me. It was just the first time he'd done it with a microphone. Growing up in our split-level house in University Place, just outside Tacoma, there was a framed family portrait that hung above the fireplace. In the original photo, I stood to Dad's left. I remember because I'd been wearing a navy cardigan I hated, and Ethan had his arm slung around Dad's shoulder like he'd won something. A year later, the frame held a cropped version. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't have noticed. But I did. The new print showed Dad and Ethan centered perfectly. Mom was still there, smiling carefully. I was gone. When I asked about it, Mom said the frame had cracked and the Photoshop had fixed it. Dad said nothing at all. That was the pattern. Not loud cruelty, not screaming, just editing. Dad had built his career the same way, carefully, strategically removing what didn't fit the narrative. As Director of Facilities Operations for the city of Tacoma, he oversaw maintenance, safety inspections, vendor contracts. 32 years of spotless reports, commendations, plaques. His company badge sat on the kitchen counter every night like a medal. Ethan fit into that picture effortlessly. 3 years older than me, confident in a way that came naturally to him. Dad brought him to job sites on Saturdays when we were kids. Let him hold flashlights, climb ladders, shake hands with supervisors. He's got leadership instincts, Dad would say. You can't teach that. I was the cautious one, the rule reader, the kid who color-coded her binders and double-checked expiration dates on the milk. I studied business compliance at the University of Washington, Tacoma, and later built a career in risk and regulatory analysis. I believed systems mattered, that details mattered. Dad used to laugh at that. You worry too much, Maya, he'd say. The real world isn't a checklist. But in our house, there was always a checklist. It just wasn't written down. Ethan achieved. Dad praised. I achieved. Dad nodded if he noticed at all. Mom kept peace, the way some people keep heirlooms, carefully, protectively. Laura Preston believed conflict could be managed if you smoothed it quickly enough. When Dad dismissed something, I said, she'd squeeze my wrist under the table. A quiet signal. Let it go. So I did. For years I did. When I started working in compliance, I developed a habit. Keep copies. Save drafts. Archive email threads. Not out of paranoia, but out of principle. If something is worth signing your name to, it's worth keeping a record of. 3 years ago, that habit became personal. An internal safety compliance report crossed my desk, one connected to Dad's department. I noticed inconsistencies. Language softened. Risk ratings adjusted downward. A vendor relationship that looked a little too comfortable. I brought it to Dad privately. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just looked at me with mild irritation and said, "Stay in your lane." That phrase stayed with me longer than it should have. Stay in your lane. In our family, lanes were assigned early. Ethan's was forward and center. Mine was off to the side. By the time the retirement invitations went out in heavy cream envelopes, the pattern had been in place for decades. The slideshow at the banquet didn't surprise me. 40 years of photos, job sites, awards. Ethan beside him in half of them. Not one of me. What surprised me wasn't being invisible. It was realizing I was tired of cooperating with the edit. And somewhere in the back of my closet, inside a file box, labeled personal, a manila folder, waited quiet, patient, and very real. 3 years earlier, on Monday, October 7th, I was still working in the city of Tacoma's Risk Management Division. It wasn't a federal holiday. It wasn't a special day. Just fluorescent lights, stale coffee, and a queue of internal compliance reviews waiting in my inbox. I remember the date because the file was time-stamped, 8:42 a.m. The subject line read, Elevator Safety, Compliance, Municipal Administration Building, Facilities Operations, fell under my father's department. At the time, I tried not to see that as relevant. In city government departments, overlap all the time. You review the paperwork in front of you. You don't personalize it. The Municipal Administration Building housed more than 600 employees, council meetings, public hearings, senior citizens renewing permits, contractors filing paperwork. The elevator modernization project had been billed as routine infrastructure maintenance. Nothing dramatic, just upgrades and code alignment. The attached compliance report looked clean at first glance. Green ratings across the board. No material safety concerns. Vendor certification verified. Sign-offs complete. But something in the formatting felt off. I'd reviewed enough reports by then to recognize patterns. Risk language follows structure. You don't soften liability phrases unless there's a reason. In Section 4, the draft version noted temporary mechanical inconsistencies, requiring follow-up calibration. The filed version said minor performance adjustments resolved. That word carries weight in compliance documentation. It implies verification, not intention. I checked the metadata. 2 versions, same day, same author, different language. I leaned back in my chair and reread both documents side by side. The original draft had a recommendation secondary inspection within 60 days. The submitted version omitted that line entirely. It wasn't a smoking gun. It wasn't proof of fraud. But it was a deviation. The vendor listed on the contract was Evergreen Vertical Systems, a regional elevator contractor that had worked repeatedly with facilities operations over the past decade. Their bids were often competitive. Their relationships were established. I pulled the vendor approval log. Everything appeared technically compliant. No red flags in procurement. Still, the change in wording lingered in my mind longer than it should have. I printed both versions, not dramatically, not with shaking hands, just the way I always did when something didn't reconcile cleanly. Paper has a different weight than a screen. Around noon, I walked upstairs to facilities operations. My father's office door was half open. His company badge hung from a hook inside the doorway, the Tacoma City seal catching the light. He looked up when I knocked. Not surprised to see me. Mildly inconvenienced. I had a question about the elevator compliance file, I said evenly. There are 2 versions. The earlier one references mechanical inconsistencies. He didn't reach for the documents immediately. That was handled, he said. Language got tightened. Tightened, I repeated. He leaned back in his chair, calm, measured. The same tone he used at city council briefings. Maya, you work in risk. I run operations. Sometimes wording creates unnecessary alarm. It also creates documentation. His eyes held mine for a second longer than usual. Stay in your lane. There it was again. Not angry, not defensive, just final. I left his office with both versions still in my folder. At the time, I told myself it was procedural. Departments adjust language. Vendors clarify scope. Internal edits happen. But that afternoon, when I scanned the original draft into my personal archive drive, before deleting it from my temporary review folder, I did something I had never done before. I labeled the file Original Do Not Discard. I didn't know then that it would be the first page in a manila folder that would one day sit on a retirement podium. I only knew one thing. The report didn't match, and neither did the story. By Tuesday, October 15th, the elevator report had already been finalized in the city's official records. I know because I checked. It wasn't dramatic. There was no announcement, no memo. Just a quiet update in the internal document system status closed. The revised version was the one permanently archived. The recommendation for a secondary inspection was gone. The language was clean, contained, resolved. That word again. I sat at my desk in risk management, staring at the screen longer than I should have. Around me, the office moved in its usual rhythm, phones, ringing printers, humming colleagues, debating Seahawks stats near the break room. Government work rarely feels urgent unless something collapses. Nothing had collapsed. That was the problem. From a procedural standpoint, the file no longer belonged to me. My review comments had been marked as addressed. My supervisor, Alan Cho, methodical close to retirement himself, stopped by my cubicle that afternoon. Facilities confirmed. Everything's been handled, he said, adjusting his glasses. Vendor documentation checks out. He wasn't dismissive, just practical. In city operations, you learn to rely on departmental certifications. You can't relitigate every adjustment in language. I nodded, understood. That was the moment I realized something subtle but important. I could pursue it, further escalate it, make noise. Or I could let it go. At home, that evening, Dad's company badge was on the kitchen counter. Like always, the Tacoma seal, catching the overhead light. Mom was making pot roast. Ethan had stopped by after work, talking about a possible promotion at his sales firm. The elevator project came up casually. Big win for the department. Dad said, slicing into the meat, "Counsel's pleased." I waited for him to mention the secondary inspection, the draft language, the adjustment. He didn't. Mom smiled. Your father's always been so careful about safety. I looked at him across the table. He met my eyes briefly, then reached for the salt. Not defiant, not apologetic, certain. In that moment, the pressure wasn't loud. It was ambient, the kind that fills a room until you forget what clean air feels like. I thought about pushing, about asking why the follow-up recommendation had disappeared, about whether Evergreen Vertical Systems had completed additional calibration that simply wasn't documented. But the dinner table had always had invisible boundaries. You could feel them even if you couldn't see them. Ethan changed the subject to his upcoming client presentation. Dad leaned forward, engaged, offering advice. Mom refilled glasses. The conversation flowed around me, like I wasn't there. Later that night, back in my apartment, I opened my laptop and reviewed the archived file one more time. The system logs showed the edit originated within facilities operations. Approved internally. Technically compliant. Legally sufficient. I stared at the original draft I'd saved in my personal drive. Temporary mechanical inconsistencies requiring follow-up calibration. It wasn't proof of wrongdoing. It was something smaller. A choice. Language adjusted. Risk reframed. Responsibility redistributed. I printed the finalized version and slid it behind the original in a manila folder. No labels yet. Just paper meeting paper. The act felt minor. But I understood something then that I hadn't fully named before. Silence is also a decision, and decisions accumulate. By the time the city began planning Dad's retirement celebration the following summer, his record would reflect decades of uninterrupted compliance. No outstanding safety flags. No pending reviews. Spotless. The elevator report would be one line in a long list of completed projects. Closed. Resolved. I told myself that maybe I was overthinking it, that institutions correct themselves, that procedures exist for a reason. Still, when I placed the folder in the back of my closet, inside a file box labeled personal, I didn't shred the original. I didn't discard it. I kept it, not because I was ready to fight, but because something inside me no longer trusted the edited version of the story. And I had started to notice how often I was the one being edited too. The retirement invitations had arrived in late August, thick cream cardstock, with the city of Tacoma seal embossed in the corner, and my mother had called the same night. "Your father would like you there," Laura said carefully, as if the wording mattered more than the truth underneath it. 2 weeks later, Thursday, September 18th, I stood in front of my closet, trying to choose a blouse that wouldn't look like I was making a statement. That's the strange thing about being raised to disappear. Even your clothing can feel like an argument. I brought the manila folder anyway. Not in my hand, not on display. It stayed inside my tote bag, tucked beside my wallet and keys, like something ordinary, like an umbrella you hope you won't need. At the Tacoma Convention Center, the room had been staged to flatter my father's story. Round tables with white linens, centerpieces that mixed small American flags with tiny metal wrenches, a projector screen cycling through photographs set to soft, upbeat music, the kind of slideshow meant to make you feel safe about the past. I stood in the doorway for a moment and watched the images roll. Dad at a ribbon cutting, Dad shaking hands with someone important, Dad in a hard hat, pointing at a set of plans, Dad at a holiday luncheon with his department. And over, Ethan at his side, older, now suit jacket, too sharp for a city banquet, smiling like a man who'd already been handed the next chapter. 40 photos, at least. Not one of me. There was a family shot near the end, Mom, Dad, Ethan, and what looked like an empty space, where I should have been. The crop was tight, almost artistic. If you didn't know, you'd assume it was always meant to be that way. I found my assigned seat at the back table nearest the exit. Someone had printed place cards in neat black script. Maya Preston sat between a retired procurement supervisor and a contractor's wife, who greeted me with polite curiosity. "Are you Dennis Preston's daughter?" she asked, leaning in. "I don't think I've ever met you." I forced a small smile and nodded. Her eyebrows lifted just a fraction. "Oh, he never mentioned you." The words landed softly, like a napkin dropped on the floor. Still, I felt the familiar shift inside my chest, the old instinct to make it easier for everyone else, to laugh it off, to smooth the moment so no one felt awkward. I didn't smooth it. I just sat down. Across the room, the head table gleamed under brighter lights. Dad's retirement plaque sat in front of his seat, bronze and heavy, already engraved with praise for unwavering commitment to safety and integrity. A microphone waited at the podium, like it belonged to him by default. Ethan stood nearby, shaking hands with people I didn't recognize, collecting smiles, the way some men collect business cards. Mom spotted me and gave a small wave. She didn't come over. She never came over. Her loyalty lived at the head table. I set my tote bag against the leg of my chair. My hand brushed the folder through the fabric. It felt thin, harmless. But I knew what was inside two versions of a report, a timeline, an edit trail, a story that didn't match the one playing on the screen. Dinner plates clinked, coffee was poured, someone tapped a glass for attention. Janice Caldwell, the city's COO, stood and approached the podium with practiced ease. She offered a warm, polished introduction, the kind you'd expect for a man retiring after decades in public service. Then she smiled and said, "Please join me in welcoming Dennis Preston." Applause swelled. My father rose and walked toward the microphone like he'd been rehearsing the moment for years. And as he began, I realized the night had never been about saying goodbye. It was about cementing a version of him that no one was allowed to challenge. He looked out at the room grinning and started thanking people, one name after another. He paused, scanned the tables, and said, "I think I've thanked everyone who matters. I think I've thanked everyone who matters." The applause began again, polite, rhythmic, almost relieved. My father stood at the podium under the soft stage lights, one hand resting beside his retirement plaque, the other loosely holding the microphone like it belonged there. From somewhere behind me, a voice called out light but clear, "What about your daughter?" There was a ripple through the room. Not loud, just enough. Dad paused. He smiled the way he always did when he thought he was about to deliver something charming. "Oh, Maya." He glanced vaguely toward the back tables, not quite looking at me. "She's nothing." A few people laughed. It wasn't cruel laughter. That's what made it worse. It was reflexive, conditioned. The room following the lead of a man they had trusted for 3 decades. My mother's gaze dropped instantly to her lap. Ethan shifted in his chair, but didn't turn around. The microphone amplified the word, "Nothing." In that moment, something inside me stopped negotiating. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel tears. I felt clarity, the kind that arrives quietly and leaves no space for doubt. I stood, the legs of my chair scraped against the floor, cutting through the fading laughter. Heads turned. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. The projector behind Dad continued cycling through photographs, his face at ribbon cuttings, his hands gripping ceremonial scissors, oblivious to the present. I picked up my tote bag. My heartbeat was steady, not fast, not shaky, just deliberate. As I walked between the tables, I felt the weight of the manila folder through the fabric. 3 years of paper, 3 years of edits, 3 years of choosing silence over friction. Dad's expression shifted when he saw me approach the stage. Not fear, not yet, just irritation, like a meeting running long. "Maya," he said quietly into the microphone, forcing a chuckle. "Now's not the time." The room leaned in. I stepped onto the low riser beside him, close enough to see the faint sheen of sweat at his temple under the lights. "I won't take long," I said evenly. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder. The motion was simple, unremarkable, paper against air. Dad's jaw tightened. "That's personal," he muttered, no longer speaking into the mic. "It concerns a city compliance record," I replied. That was the first time I saw something flicker across his face calculation. He shifted the microphone lower, trying to reclaim control of the tone. "We can talk about whatever this is later," he said louder now. "This is a celebration. It involves facilities operations," I said, turning slightly toward the audience, "and an internal safety compliance report." The word compliance changed the temperature of the room. I saw it in the posture of the city council member near the front, in the way a contractor stopped smiling, in the subtle straightening of Janice Caldwell in her chair. Dad stepped closer to me, voice low, but urgent. "You don't understand how these things work." "I do," I said. That was the truth. And for the first time, I didn't soften it. He reached for the folder. I didn't pull it away. I simply held it between us visible. The projector behind him shifted to another photograph. Dad, shaking hands, beneath a banner that read, "Commitment to Integrity." The irony hung in the air, almost tangible. Janice stood. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. But when she began walking toward the stage, the room parted, without anyone being told to move. Dad noticed her approach. His shoulders stiffened. "Maya," he said again, this time without the microphone. A warning. For years that tone had been enough. It wasn't anymore. I turned slightly toward Janice and extended the folder. And for the first time that night, my father's smile was completely gone. Janice Caldwell did not open the folder on stage. She held it with both hands, composed, aware of every pair of eyes in the ballroom. "Thank you, Maya," she said evenly. "We'll review this appropriately." Appropriately. It was the kind of word that bought time. My father recovered faster than I expected. He stepped back toward the microphone before Janice could say anything else. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, with a tight smile, "after 32 years in public service, I suppose I shouldn't be surprised that even tonight comes with paperwork." A few strained chuckles surfaced, enough to thin the tension. He gestured lightly toward me. "My daughter works in risk management. She takes her job very seriously." The phrasing was careful, controlled. Not accusation, not yet. But it reframed me. Not a whistleblower. Not a daughter confronting dishonesty. Just an overzealous employee misreading procedure. I felt the shift immediately. The room didn't erupt against him. It recalibrated. Janice gave him a measured look, then addressed the crowd. "We'll conclude the formal remarks here. Thank you all for coming." Applause returned, softer now. Uneven. The event dissolved into clusters of murmurs. Dad leaned close to me, voice low enough that only I could hear. "You've made your point." "I didn't make a point," I replied. I handed over documentation. His jaw tightened. "You don't understand the damage you can cause with half information." That word again. Damage. As if the paperwork, not the edits, were the threat. Mom approached us, eyes glossy. "Can we please not do this here?" she whispered. Her hand hovered near my arm, but didn't quite touch me. Ethan arrived seconds later, posture rigid. "What exactly are you trying to accomplish?" he asked quietly. The question edged with frustration rather than anger. "Accuracy," I said. He exhaled sharply. "There are processes for concerns like that. Internal ones. I used them." He didn't respond to that. Across the room, I noticed two council members speaking in hushed tones. One of them glanced toward us, then toward Janice, who had already exited through a side door with the folder under her arm. The folder was no longer in my possession. For the first time that night, the outcome wasn't mine to control. Dad straightened his tie and stepped back toward a group of department heads, smile returning as if on cue. I watched him pivot seamlessly into handshakes and measured laughter. Narratives don't collapse easily. They defend themselves. I left before dessert was served. Outside, the September air was cool, the parking lot lights humming overhead. My phone buzzed before I reached my car. Unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. "This is Thomas Green," the voice said. I recognized the name, Deputy City Attorney. I'd seen it on internal memos. "Miss Preston, I understand you provided documentation this evening." "Yes. There will likely be a formal review. I'd advise you not to discuss the matter publicly." Advise. Not threaten, but close. "I haven't," I said. There was a pause. "You should also be aware," he continued, "that initiating compliance inquiries can trigger reciprocal evaluations. Standard procedure, reciprocal." I understood what he meant. My own reports, my own record, my own career. When the call ended, I sat in my car with both hands on the steering wheel. I had known there would be consequences. But knowing and feeling are different things. By the time I got home, a text from Ethan was waiting. "Dad says you blindsided him. He's talking to counsel. Not furious, strategic." The folder had shifted the ground, but it hadn't broken it. Not yet. And, for the first time since standing up from my chair, I realized something important. This wasn't going to be about one edited report. It was going to be about credibility, his and mine. The following Monday, September 22nd was not dramatic. No one escorted my father out of City Hall. No emergency press release lit up local news. The machinery of accountability does not roar to life. It hums. When I arrived at the risk management office that morning, my access badge still worked. My inbox was full. My calendar unchanged. On the surface, nothing had shifted. By 10:15 a.m., that illusion cracked. An internal memo from the city attorney's office appeared in my inbox marked confidential. Compliance review initiated. It was brief. A formal inquiry had been opened regarding documentation procedures within facilities operations. Relevant personnel might be contacted for interviews. It did not mention my father by name. It did not mention me, but it referenced the exact project number from the elevator report. The system had begun moving. An hour later, Alan Cho stepped into my cubicle. He didn't sit. "There's going to be a review," he said quietly. "Legal will likely want to speak with you." I expected that. He studied me for a moment. "They'll also review your handling of the file." Reciprocal evaluation. Thomas Green's warning replayed in my mind. I documented everything I said. Alan nodded once. "Make sure your documentation is complete." That was not advice. It was survival. During lunch, I didn't join the others in the break room. I closed my office door and opened my personal drive, the original draft. The system timestamps I had captured, the email threads noting the change in language. And then I saw it. Buried in the metadata of the revised file was a secondary editor tag. Not just facilities operations, executive override credentials. The username was abbreviated, but I recognized the structure. It wasn't my father's login. It was someone higher in the approval chain. That changed the scale. This wasn't a quiet, departmental adjustment. It had been elevated. I leaned back in my chair, heart steady, but sharper now. If the narrative was going to frame this as my overreach, the audit trail told a different story. The language hadn't simply been softened, it had been deliberately authorized. That meant the review would widen, which meant control would thin. At 3:40 p.m., I received a formal interview request from Thomas Green's office for Wednesday morning. Business hours. Recorded. That night, Dad called. I let it ring twice before answering. "You've triggered something you can't contain," he said, without greeting. "I didn't trigger it," I replied. "The documentation did." There was a pause. I could hear him breathing, controlled but tight. "They're looking at everything now," he said. "Do you understand that?" "Yes. Your own department won't protect you if this turns political." That was the closest he'd come to honesty. "I'm not asking them to," I said. Silence stretched between us. For the first time, he sounded less like a man managing a story and more like a man measuring risk. When the call ended, I pulled the manila folder from my desk drawer at home. It felt different now. Not reactive, not emotional, strategic. I added a printed copy of the metadata log. Then I made a second copy and sealed it in an envelope addressed to myself, postmarked, evidence untouched. Not dramatic, methodical. The mistake I had made at the banquet was assuming the truth alone was enough. It isn't. Truth needs structure. By midnight, I had mapped the approval hierarchy from memory: who signed off, who had override access, who would have seen the language before it was finalized. The story was no longer about a father and a daughter. It was about governance. And governance leaves footprints. For the first time since the banquet, I didn't feel cornered. I felt prepared. The system had started moving. Now I needed to understand how to move with it. Wednesday, September 24th, came with rain that looked like it had been there forever. At 9 a.m., I sat in a small conference room on the 4th floor of the Tacoma Municipal Building with a voice recorder on the table and a legal pad in front of Thomas Green. His suit was plain, his tone quieter than you'd expect from someone who could end careers with a sentence. He didn't ask how the banquet went. He asked about timestamps. "Walk me through when you first received the draft," he said. "When you noticed the revision. When you saved the original." So I did, methodically. I referenced the project number, the date in October, the system status change in mid-month. I described the language shift without editorializing. I offered the metadata printout and the sealed, postmarked envelope copy. Green's eyes flicked once, just once, at the executive override tag. He didn't react, but he didn't move on quickly either. By the time I left the building, I understood something I hadn't fully appreciated before. The review was no longer about whether I had been too serious. It was about who had authorized the edit. That afternoon, the first ripple hit the surface. An all-staff email from Janice Caldwell went out to Facilities Operations and Risk Management, Documentation Procedure Review. Cooperation required. It listed a temporary records hold, restrictions on file revisions, and mandatory interviews for certain roles. My father's name still wasn't in writing, but his department was suddenly operating under a spotlight. The next day, Evergreen Vertical Systems contract status flipped to under review in the procurement portal. Vendors in city work notice things like that, the way small towns notice a closed diner instantly. And with conclusions they don't say out loud. By Friday, the retirement plaque was gone. I didn't see it myself at first. I heard it from Alan Cho, who said it the way you'd mention weather, neutral, factual. They took down Dennis's plaque. From the lobby display, he told me, eyes steady. Facilities requested it be updated. Pending the review. Updated. A polite word for removal. That same evening, Ethan texted me again. Shorter than before. Dad's badge got deactivated today. He says it's routine. In city government, badges don't get deactivated routinely. Not unless someone wants to control access to files. The local news didn't name him, but it didn't have to. Tacoma is a big city that still feels like a small one when it comes to reputations. A short segment ran on the Friday night broadcast. City initiates review of documentation practices in facilities operations. No faces, no accusations. Just the phrase, documentation practices, spoken with that particular anchorman emphasis that tells viewers it matters. On Saturday, my mother called. Her voice sounded thinner than usual, as if she'd spent the week swallowing words. "Your father hasn't been sleeping," she said. "He keeps saying you've embarrassed him." I didn't correct her. I didn't defend myself. I had learned that arguing with my mother was like trying to change the tide with a spoon. "What's happening at work?" I asked instead. She hesitated. "People aren't calling. Not like they used to." That was the real consequence. Not an official reprimand. Not a headline. Silence from the people who once clapped. On Monday, September 29th, another email arrived, this time from the city attorney's office. A formal audit had expanded to include prior records involving executive override credentials. Expanded. My father had built his legacy on spotless compliance. Now the system was rewinding his story one file at a time, and I was still sitting at my kitchen table each night, not relieved, just braced. Because karma doesn't feel like victory when it's your family standing in its path. It feels like gravity, unstoppable, and finally, real. The formal findings were issued on Friday, October 17th. No sirens, no courtroom, Just a 14-page report released through the city attorney's office at 4:32 p.m., uploaded quietly to the municipal transparency portal, where anyone patient enough could read it. I was still at my desk when the notification came through. Findings summary, documentation, override, irregularities, confirmed. The language was measured, but the conclusion was not. Executive override credentials had been used to alter compliance language in multiple facilities' operations reports over a 3-year period. The report stated that the edits materially affected the classification of risk. It confirmed that oversight protocols had been bypassed. My father's name appeared on page 6, not accused of criminal misconduct, but cited for administrative violations and failure to disclose procedural deviations. Effective immediately, his retirement commendation was rescinded. His post-retirement consulting eligibility was revoked. The case would be referred to the State Ethics Board for review. It was not dramatic. It was definitive. At 5:10 p.m., an internal email announced that interim leadership would be appointed within facilities operations pending structural review. The plaque would not be returning. I didn't feel triumph. I felt still. That evening, I drove past City Hall on my way home. The lobby lights glowed against the glass. Through the window, I could see the wall where recognition plaques usually hung. His space was empty, not vandalized, not shamed, just blank. On Sunday afternoon, Dad asked to meet. We chose a neutral place, a small coffee shop near Point Defiance Park. He looked older than he had a month ago. Not physically frail, just stripped of performance. I never thought it would end like this, he said. I didn't either, I replied. He stirred his coffee longer than necessary. You could have come to me. I did, I said gently. 3 years ago. He didn't argue that. For the first time in my life, there was no attempt to reframe the narrative. No softening, no redirection, just consequence sitting between us like a third person at the table. I built my career on being trusted, he said finally, and I built mine on documentation, I answered. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't defiant, it was simply true. We didn't resolve everything that day. There was no apology that erased the past, no cinematic reconciliation. But when we stood to leave, he didn't call me nothing, and that mattered. On Monday, October 20th, I returned to work without whispers trailing behind me. My badge still worked. My file was clean. Alan nodded once in passing, professional respect, nothing more, nothing less. A week later, Janice Caldwell stopped by my office. We're implementing new oversight controls, she said. Your documentation helped clarify gaps. Helped clarify. Not heroic, not rebellious, useful. That was enough. At home, the manila folder no longer lived in the back of my closet. I placed it in a filing cabinet with a simple label closed. Not forgotten, closed. Justice. I've learned isn't loud. It doesn't clap for you. It doesn't mend every fracture in a family. But it stands. And so do I. If you've ever had to choose between silence and truth, I'd genuinely like to know what that cost you and what it gave back. Share your thoughts below. And if this story resonated, consider staying for the next one. Sometimes the hardest battles are the quietest.